Hey everyone. In this short video, I'm going to talk about the trade-offs that you encounter when it comes to implementing your experiment. And specifically, I'm just going to talk or give you a quick overview of different alternative routes to actually, making it happen and implement your experiment, and talk briefly about the potential, like the advantages and disadvantages that come with each of these different routes, right? So we talked about a lot about different, types of experiments, and especially when we're talking about experiments that are happening online, for example, using social media platforms. Oftentimes, they require partnering up with companies such as Facebook or Twitter or other companies, right? So we talked about examples of actual research along these lines, and of course that's oftentimes a very attractive way of kind of um, implementing whatever study you're interested in, partnering with an organization, someone in the industry that has access to additional metadata, for example, or that allows you to kind of connect to certain participants or respondents. So having that infrastructure is really, really attractive, but of course it also comes with disadvantages. And it's also not easy to ultimately, build up these relationships, and potentially, first of all, you have to kind of have a connection to that organization, and the organization, whatever company you're interested in working with, maybe Facebook or others, um, um, first have to, of course, be interested in working with you. And we'll talk in some of the later semesters about kind of the sorry, and later in the subsequent weeks, we'll later in the semester we'll talk a little bit about routes to that. Sometimes companies, for example, have open calls for research projects and things like that. So there are opportunities, but of course it's by no means easy to build up these partnerships. The big advantage of a partnership with, for example, someone in the industry is that your costs are really low compared to other ways of implementing your experiment, because you can rely on the infrastructure and getting access to respondents through, for example, social media platforms and things like that. So that's a great advantage, but at the same time, you kind of give up some control um, with regard to what types of manipulations you can implement, what types of experiments you can run, and also to what extent you can, what kinds of results you can ultimately publish, right? Because of course, industry partners have strong inherent interest in only publishing certain findings versus others. So this reduces your control over the research project to some extent, due to the partnership, and of course also potentially introduces ethical problems, right? So ethics are potentially complex. On the flip side, of course, realism, so kind of the external validity questions are usually, um, or they're usually advantages when it comes to realism and external validity, because if you're partnering with, for example, a social media platform or whatever, and you can directly examine behavior on that platform as an outcome variable, then you're directly observe you're directly measuring the behavior that you're interested in, so that people interacting on that platform itself is highly realistic, in the sense that it's directly the behavior that you're interested in. Okay. So of course, it's not possible for everyone to kind of partner with industry, or with larger organizations. And so in many cases, you kind of just have to do it yourself, and you have to implement your experiment yourself, right? One alternative, or one possible kind of strategy if you want to implement your own experiment, is to use existing systems, right? And so the paper, the Munger paper, that kind of describes a really cool experiment on Twitter, is one example like that, right? So they're using, or he's using an existing system, Twitter, um, to kind of implement a experimental manipulation. Specifically, he's using Twitter bots to kind of call out racial harassment, and then looks at the effect of these interventions on Twitter users' subsequent posting behavior, right? So this is using an existing system, using the environment that Twitter provides, and by virtue of doing that, of course the underlying costs are incredibly low, right? But at the same time, there's a little bit less control over what, how there are a lot of constraints on, what type of treatment you can actually administer, how you can administer it, and things like that, right? So control is obviously lower. You kind of have to work within the framework that is available to you, right? So for example, on Twitter, using bots, but even then, you potentially have issues with, terms of service on Twitter, for example, might prohibit certain certain type of bots, or certain types of interventions, right? So again, ethics again can be potentially complex, but realism of these experiments is comparatively high. Again, because you're exploring, you can depending on what your outcome of interest is, you can directly explore behaviors that are relevant to your underlying theory and things like that, right? If that is not an option, if you cannot kind of rely on existing systems like, social media platforms and things like that, you can of course kind of just build your own experiment. And by building your own experiment, if thinking back to the previous video, of course there's a wide range of possible types of experiments, field and lab experiments, and to what extent you conduct them online versus not online. So there's a wide variety, but in general, the costs kind of related to implementing an experiment like that is generally higher than the previous two examples. But on the other hand, it gives you a lot more control over the treatment administration, the design of the treatment, and things like that. Of course, on the one hand, that leads to that higher degree of control, and the lack of relying on for example an industry partner or an existing system online, makes these ethical concerns less of a problem. But of course, you could have issues with regard to realism. External validity might be a bigger concern, right? And lastly, and this is probably the largest or the on the one hand, a kind of a high reward potential route for implementing your experiment, but of course it needs a lot of infrastructure and startup costs, which is kind of building your own product. And there are examples in the chapter of researchers kind of providing a platform that people use, that people want to use, when it comes to, I don't know, access to music and things like that, that on the one hand provides a service to potential respondents that they actually gives them an incentive to kind of use that product, but also gives you a platform to implement the experiment itself, right? So of course the costs to kind of get that to run are extremely high, but at the same time, you have kind of the advantage of having control over the environment of the product itself, of course, and having a highly realistic environment. But of course, that is not easy to implement. For if you don't have the backing of if you don't already have infrastructure ready, for when it comes to online platforms and things like that. Having access to web developers and things like that. It's not something that a grad student, for example, could easily do. But nevertheless, if you do have the privilege of having the financial support and also the personnel to kind of build your own product that allows you to examine that you can launch, and that allows you to directly implement experiments among users who want to use that product. Of course, that's an ideal scenario, but obviously not available to everyone. Nevertheless, those were different trade-offs when it comes to implementing your experiment in different contexts. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about some general advice on experimental designs.